So this has just been a very weird week in human history. Like the sky is turning weird shades of orange, apparently. Joe Biden, they asked him, hey, what about fracking? And his answer was like, well, we've got to do a transition. And by 2050, we're going to have this whole thing together. And I'm sitting here, I'm watching this footage and I'm thinking like 2050.
2050, we're going to be so dead.
Can you compare like where we are now? It's 2020. So you're going back like 30 years. So like if you can compare like the way that our climate is and was in 1990 and what our world was like in 1990, that's like the space between the Cold War and now. That is like an entire generation. And seeing as we're dealing with these effects and they're being accelerated more and more, like right now, we're having economic displacement. Right now, we're having climate refugees. Right now, one of our patrons literally got like burned out of their house. In fact, one of our patrons and one of our cast members, Alyssa Vieira, we had her on Thursday, like last Thursday, and she literally had to leave her house because of the fires going on in California. Was staying in a hotel, obviously didn't have money. It totally wrecked her savings or whatever. And so she's like starting from scratch, has got nothing. 30 years is a very long time to put a significant dent in this problem. Kaitlin, you're here with us now. What was your reaction, maybe to that specifically, but just to this week in general? It's been like a rough week.
Yeah, this has been a rough week. I'm not in California, although I live in Sacramento, but I'm not there right now. I grew up in New Mexico, and that's where my family is, and so I'm staying with them at the moment. So I wasn't in it, but almost everyone I know was, and just seeing what it's like back home is just terrible. And Biden is, and the whole people behind Biden, all of this is just, they're delusional. I mean, even just thinking back 5 years and the way that the weather was and what, we were, how it seems like it was, something that would, okay, yeah, maybe in 10 years we'll see results, impacts of this. And it's like, no, it's right here, right now, completely falling apart right in front of our faces. And the idea that we can wait any amount of time means that millions of animals and people will die and suffer. That's the plan that we've got from the best option for president right now.
We've got my co-host Kennedy Cooper. He's from Albuquerque, and he lives here, and he's always talking about New Mexico politics and how a lot of these people who are being like pumped up nationally as like the new hope for progressivism, when you actually are living in the state and you get like your microscope out for like, how is this affecting me locally where I live? And like, it's not enough to mitigate the course of history and the bad shit that's going down right now.
Yeah, well, one congressperson at a time. We get with each cycle what we're going to get, like maybe half a dozen if we're extremely lucky, people who are kind of like on our side, and they're up against the entire establishment as they get there, and learning the ropes. We've got to think of something bigger than that, because we don't have that kind of time at this point.
Yeah, I've been talking to people talking about, by the time that the polar ice caps start melting, we'll have a caucus of like 45 people who think that's a bad thing. And it's extremely frustrating. But for people whose, number one issue is the climate, I watched a documentary called Legalized Democracy. I watched some of it. And one of the things that I took away, and I think that more people should take away, is that the influence of money on our political system, no matter what your number one issue is, this should probably be your number two issue, because it's going to be hard for you to get, like, when we talk about, well, why is Biden like slow rolling on fracking? Well, he's worried about Pennsylvania unions, and they're donating to the campaign, and also they're in a critical state. And if there's not support from there, then he's going to have a harder row. So, hey, who are the people who are militant about like not drowning, and how much are they donating? And unfortunately, because of our current campaign finance rules, like anybody who's running a progressive campaign is going in knowing that they're going to be outspent 10-1 as just a matter of fact. And Kennedy, who we talked about earlier, our other New Mexico consultant, the whole team's here. What's up? How you doing?
Hey, I'm okay. How are you?
I was just talking to Kaitlin about how you were just recording that wonderful Star Trek podcast that's coming out just when it's ready. We're taking our time and getting it right. How'd it go? How was the recording session?
It was great. It was great. But I'm glad to be here now.
And people will be really excited when that goes down. Kaitlin, can you talk about that documentary and just your general mission for people who don't already know your deal and who you are?
Yeah, so Legalized Democracy, it was a kind of introduction to Move to Amend that we put together some years ago. So at this point, it could potentially use a refresh in terms of
right
higher straits that we're in. But it's available on YouTube for free, and you can just do an internet search for it and find it if you want to check it out. It's only 30 minutes. Move to Amend is a campaign to amend the Constitution of the United States to make clear that only human beings have constitutional rights and that money is not speech, so that government at all levels can regulate campaign spending. And we were formed kind of in preparation for the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that came out in 2010. Although those of us who started Move to Amend have been working against corporate constitutional rights for some of my colleagues going on, 20 years before that. I've been working on this issue for 19 years myself. And we really do see it, like you said, as like a kind of foundational reasons, the legal reasons why we are in the mess that we are in now, and why regulation and then even some legislation that we try to pass, even if we're successful, is undermined by corporations' ability to claim constitutional rights, including the First Amendment, which is why corporations can contribute money to the political process, and just undermine our ability to govern ourselves at the local level, state level, and federal level, like with Citizens United. And until we address that, we're not going to be able to put forward the solutions that we need to address. And I agree with you that, climate change is sort of front and center, but this is true whether we're talking about, food safety, whether we're talking about the toxins that are in the products that we are exposed to, whether we're talking about, just self-governance, whether we're talking about the prison industrial complex, which is, largely private corporations, all of these areas that corporations are dominating, we can't hold them accountable legally because they have more rights than we do, according to the Supreme Court and, the judicial system at this point. And so anything that we do to try to rein in their power or curb their excess or protect the public or the environment or workers is under threat of being overturned with the argument that it violates their constitutional rights. And so democracy is really impossible, and that's not because of Trump. It's because of the way our legal system has been operating for the last 150 years in this country.
Man, one of my first political memories of discussion of campaign finance. Well, actually, one of my first memories of campaign finance was McCain-Feingold. So actually, let's go way back in the time machine because that's some good historical context. Did McCain-Feingold not fix all this stuff? Everybody seemed to pat themselves on the back when that was passed, and it seems like we're in maybe a worse political situation now than we were way back then. So as somebody who's aware of the history of all that stuff, like what happened?
Well, I mean, McCain-Feingold was a pretty anemic solution to the problem of big money in politics, right? So even that was not, the publicly funded elections that would be the better solution. I mean, we publicly pay for our transportation infrastructure. We should publicly pay for our election infrastructure so that, it doesn't it isn't influenced by who has more money, but rather who has better ideas and is more compelling to the public. But nonetheless, McCain-Feingold was passed after much fanfare and effort. And what Citizens United did so it was on the books for a couple decades. And what Citizens United did is overturn kind of the main thrust of it and made it so that corporations and the wealthy, in putting together a PAC, cannot be limited in the amount of money that they can spend in elections. And we've seen, a huge amount of money poured into elections. And initially it was kind of like Republicans who were able to take advantage of Citizens United. But I read an article recently about how, Democrats actually at this point are beating Republicans on raising money for super PACs and outspending Republicans on the whole. So it's both of them. And what it has meant is that the number of people who have influence over, especially national elections, but this is definitely relevant at the state and local level too, increasingly, has shrunk to just, a tiny number, which is the same situation that we're in terms of, who has most of the wealth. It's just shrinking. And so there's just this tiny pool of people who have power and influence, whether it's, economically or politically. And the rest of us are sort of left to choose, maybe if we can get voting access, which is increasingly difficult, between who, the powers that be, the wealthy, the extremely wealthy, kind of vet and decide will be, the candidates that we have available to us. I mean, definitely for president and Congress, but like I said, we've seen lots of examples over the last 10 years since Citizens United, since that decision, where small communities have just huge amounts of money dumped into even just city council races.
Right.
They're dealing with something that impacts especially a corporate entity that has, whether it's like Walmart or, here, well, I'm not in California right now, but I would normally say here in California, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, our monopoly utility company that basically runs the state. And that's true, across the country.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kennedy.
We've talked about on this show before, the Seattle City Council races at this point, have more money poured into them than some states' entire politics, for those same cycles. And it's just, when millions of dollars are being thrown into races that small, because there's absolutely no limits on that kind of stuff, that's completely devastating to these races in a way that goes beyond even the damage that's being done to federal races a lot of the time.
Right, absolutely. And the reason why so the solution in my mind to that would be to limit the amount of money that can be spent in a particular race. To say, if you're going to run for city council in a city of 1 million, you should be able to get elected with, whatever. Let's just throw out a number, for the sake of argument. $50,000,
Sure.
Everybody should only be able to spend that much. And then it's how you spend that money and what kind of outreach you're doing to voters. But we can't pass a law like that because the Supreme Court in the 1970s, before Citizens United, ruled that money is speech. And so therefore, those donors have a constitutional right to contribute as much money as they want. And government doesn't have the authority to limit the amount that you can spend in a race. And so that's why the We the People amendment that Move to Amend is working on is so essential, because then we could pass laws like that, or publicly funded elections, which has passed in a few places, but the Supreme Court has really undermined through decisions subsequently as well. And so it's all just voluntary. And meanwhile, you can have folks on the other end who are, elect to not choose to use the publicly funded elections and to finance them privately. And so with the money in politics piece, and then the other piece that I want to, just make sure that people understand is this isn't even just about money in politics. This is true, if a community is trying to pass a law, we talked about fracking at the beginning. Communities have tried to pass laws saying that fracking is not allowed where, in their jurisdiction, because it poisons the water and pollutes the environment and is dangerous and is bad for the world as a whole. and fracking companies have sued these communities and said, you can't pass this law because it violates our constitutional rights. So it's not even just about money and politics. It's like there's the political electoral realm where they dominate, but then also if we can get our elected officials to pass legislation to protect us, then they can undermine it and say, well, we didn't have authority to do that in the first place because it violates their constitutional rights. Never mind, so what about our rights when the courts are weighing corporate rights versus human rights? They're siding on the side of corporate rights by and large, and throwing human rights out the door. Never mind, nature doesn't even have rights in our legal system.
I just want to point out too that when you talk about super PAC spending, it's not just that it's funded dirtily, the spending is also dirty, because super PACs are completely unaccountable in their spending. Which is something like if you run a political campaign, people get in trouble all the time because they had, a night where they got an internal poll that showed they were winning and they took the whole team out for drinks and spent $200 out of the campaign finances. And they'll get in big trouble for something like that sometimes, for doing that out of a campaign. But a super PAC, you could spend the money however you want, which means it can just be bribe money. It could be anything.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, what Citizens United did was basically make extortion and bribery legal. So, a lobbyist can go into a Congress member's office and say, we have this legislation that we either want to see passed or we don't want to see succeed. And, I've got a PAC here with $10 million and we're trying to decide which races we're going to weigh in on, and how you vote will determine what we're going to do. And that's not illegal according to the Supreme Court, because that's not political corruption. That is what they ruled, actually not in Citizens United, but in the subsequent case, McCutcheon versus FEC, where they said the only thing that will count as corruption in our mind is quid pro quo corruption, where you literally say, I've got $10,000, I will give it to you if you pass this. But if you go around the side, or you just wine and dine people and all of that is completely legitimate, and they say doesn't cause corruption in our system, which any regular person knows is absolutely ludicrous.
We have a system that is designed only to catch the dumbest criminals, but encourages crime otherwise. Don't embarrass us while you're committing these crimes. One of my first memories in terms of activism on this issue that's outside the political process was the Young Turks, and Cenk Uygur would yell about campaign finance, and his face would turn bright beet red, and he would smash his hand on the table, go wolf this back, wolfdishback.com, and he would just yell that every couple days for at least 10 minutes. Can you talk about Move to Amend's history and obviously I can name 5 grassroots groups that have tried to tackle this subject, and what makes y'all's approach to this especially worth noting for people who agree on this issue and are looking for a place to organize around it?
Yeah, so there definitely are several different groups that came together either to put together campaigns or formed as organizations after Citizens United and since Citizens United. So some of the things that set Move to Amend apart are that our amendment, or We the People amendment, which is House Joint Resolution 48 in the House, and we're working to get it introduced in the Senate still, is the only one that actually addresses corporate constitutional rights as a whole. So some of the other proposals and the other groups are working to address only the First Amendment rights of corporations, but corporations are also able to assert Fourth Amendment protections, privacy protections, which is why it is really hard to know what they're doing and also what is in their products, because they can use the argument that they have Fourth Amendment privacy protections. They also have Fifth Amendment protections. So companies have been able to get environmental legislation overturned using the argument that an environmental law is a takings, and they're owed future profits that they would have made if the law hadn't been passed. And so that makes it so that communities can't afford to protect their local environment, or states can't protect their environments. And then also 14th Amendment protections. And then First Amendment protections like freedom of religion, which the Supreme Court also gave to corporations after Citizens United. So and really, like, we don't even know where they will go next. And so we have to make clear that the Constitution only applies to human beings. That's kind of the most fundamental point. And our amendment is the only one that actually does that. The others kind of try to really, get in there and be very specific just around campaign finance. And that we think is likely to create a situation where they will figure out how to get around that, and then we will need another amendment to do the job that ours would do in the first place. So that's one piece. Another piece is that we are a grassroots campaign, so a lot of these groups are based in DC, and honestly, at this point, having worked for 10 years dealing with Congress and like the Beltway nonprofit industrial complex, I would say that we're not going to get any kind of revolutionary solution to the problems from anyone who is immersed in the Washington, D.C. world. Because that's just not what it's set up to do. It's set up to appease donors and kind of give the appearance that a lot is being done when actually very little is being done, or the bare minimum is being done, just enough to kind of get people off their backs. And that's just kind of the paradigm, unfortunately, of our political capital. And so we really pride ourselves that we are a grassroots group. We are based in the States, of real people who are not looking at what's possible, but what's necessary in terms of our demands. And then the last piece is that we're the only amendment group that really from the very beginning said that a huge fundamental piece of this whole question of who is a person under law in this country is rooted in our white supremacist history. And the idea that property is more important than human beings, again, like, this isn't a new problem. This is cases upon cases upon cases that were built because of the foundation of this country. And so we have anti-racist analysis and understanding of the problem in that context that, frankly, a lot of the other groups try to sidestep in the interest of kind of being, cross-partisan and working with the right wing in a way that we think undermines ultimately what those groups are willing to call for and what needs to be done. And so those are kind of three of the main pieces of why I work with Move to Amend instead of some of the other groups that are working on issues that sound pretty similar in some ways, but when you kind of look deeper, are looking at kind of halfway measures or a halfway critique of the United States that isn't enough to get the job done.
Are you frustrated? We've had, national candidates that come on and they talk about campaign finance. And I feel like there's a dot that needs to be connected between our current system of campaign finance and who profits the most from that system. And it's not just consultants, it's also television networks, because they sell this airtime and it goes for incredibly inflated rates. One of the most underreported stories of this year's election cycle, in my opinion, is that, like, when Mike Bloomberg bought all of those ads wall to wall, it priced so many people out of the market. It was almost like a national gentrification of the airwaves. And because of that, the media has a vested interest in, like, blocking this policy, even though, like, it's obviously very popular with most people across the political spectrum when you ask about it. And also because, like, most people do not enjoy watching political advertisements, no matter where they are ideologically. Like, just normal people don't enjoy watching that. Are you frustrated with the way the media has treated this issue, and just doesn't really seem to cover it in the depth that maybe it deserves in comparison to all of these other issues that are intrinsically tied to it?
Oh, absolutely. And you totally have hit the nail on the head in terms of why that problem exists and kind of what the motivation on at least, dominant corporate, especially television media, but also radio as well, although not that many people listen to the radio compared to, how it used to be. But certainly when Citizens United first happened, there was like a little bit of a surge, but then as things kind of fell back into place and the new normal was established, I think it's absolutely true that, major corporate networks, I mean, not only do they have an interest because of the money that they get from political campaigns, but I mean, these are giant corporations that these networks are owned by giant corporations themselves, and those corporations own all kinds of other areas too. And so these really aren't media companies. These are corporations that happen to have, an arm in the media, and they absolutely have an interest in maintaining the status quo. And so, that's where the internet and social media is so critical and important. And unfortunately, the platforms that we use there are private corporations as well. And so while on one hand, we've been able to reach a lot of people through Twitter and, even Facebook, at Move to Amend and bring people in, it's always vulnerable to, are we really, and this is not just true for us, this is all, I think leftist organizing is like, are we going to be able to depend on these networks to be able to reach people, or are they going to just pull the plug on us at some point? And what is the plan B? And so, independent media is incredibly important, but also, I think that having a systemic analysis and kind of looking at things in terms of how drawing the connections, connecting the dots, that isn't something that for the most part, most media, does for us in all areas. And this is no exception. And so that's part of why we put Legalized Democracy together, for example, so that, we could kind of provide that information to people to see with their own eyes, because they're not going to find that on TV.
Kennedy, I'm going to throw it to you. What's on your mind out of all of these breaking issues?
Well, I guess I'm curious to hear from Kaitlin's perspective. I agree that this is like critical to fixing our democracy in terms of like the money issue is like at the top, pretty much at the top of the list. I don't think any other reforms can really be that lasting without it. But I'm curious to hear from you. What are some of the other barriers that you think are preventing us from having fair elections? And what are like maybe some of the top issues outside of just the campaign finance issue that you'd like to see change in the way that we do our democracy and our elections?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think the media piece is key, and we need to, break up the big media, and then some other things that I would say. Wealth inequality is actually incredibly fundamental to all of this as well. I mean, yes, there's the piece of, if you have more money, you can have more influence. And so therefore it shouldn't just be that we deal with that in the electoral realm by equalizing who has access to political influence, but just in general, we need to redistribute wealth in this country and the world. And I think that a big key policy piece to that is healthcare and Medicare for all, and making sure that people have access to healthcare, so that in an affordable way that everyone has access, so that people are not dependent on staying in jobs that they that they're only in because they need that insurance. And as obviously we have seen with the pandemic, even that isn't reliable, because your job goes away and then all of a sudden you're in potentially a health and economic crisis in your family. And then the other piece of that too, I think, is that, the labor movement as a whole has its hands really tied by the fact that negotiations have to involve, healthcare, when that should all just be accounted for, and we should have it. And then, there's a lot of unions that are not really doing good work, but I still believe in the labor movement, and that, people should be represented in the workplace if we are going to have, a capitalist society. And therefore, what those negotiations should be about, power and decision making and wages. And if we had Medicare for all, that would just ease the burden on workers in such a huge way that I think that we could really use that to organize more effectively for political power as well.
In terms of campaign finance, you are somebody who does a lot of travel, and you also do a lot of activism across the country, just on like a multi-state level. What is the most egregious story that you have since you've started? Is there anything that just boiled your blood in terms of, we really need to fix this, like, post haste? What's the most frustrating situation you've had to deal with politically?
Oh man, that's a good question, and I'm not sure. Nothing is coming to me off the top of my head that's like. I mean, I would say that the situation in California with Pacific Gas and Electric Company, burning down the town of Paradise through negligence, and then
I haven't heard of this. Can you give that entire story? Because I've heard vaguely of it, but I don't recall the details or anything like that.
Okay, well, so I mean, there's a complicated reality in California around Pacific Gas and Electric Company that goes to as far back as Enron and deregulation. So, but maybe to jump ahead a little bit, I mean, basically it's a monopoly, and so there is a regulatory agency that's responsible for overseeing them, but it's incredibly ineffective, and PG&E is able to spend large amounts of money to influence politics in California, and then also they are able to that's where we get our power from, and so there's a certain amount of that they can kind of just say, like, well, this is how we're just going to do it, and maybe we have to pay a fine if we don't comply with whatever demands from the state, but then they just do, and that's a cost of doing business, and then that can be written off their taxes. That's what companies do for the most part when they are fined. And so on the whole, it's been found over the last 5 years or so that PG&E has not been maintaining properly their lines. They've been cutting corners left and right. So as a result, we have a number of dangerous situations, and the fire in Paradise from a few years ago where the entire town burned down, including the childhood home of one of our staff members. Our program director, Jessica, at Move to Amend, grew up in Paradise, and her whole family's home burned, and everyone she knows from her childhood. And these folks are still, a lot of people are still homeless. There's been a tremendous amount of trauma and PTSD that people are suffering. People are still living in tents in like a former Walmart parking lot, and the country has kind of by and large moved on. And now there's a whole series of new situations this summer in California, as we all know, and we talked about at the beginning of the show. So it was found that the reason why that fire was started in the first place was negligence on PG&E's parts in terms of not maintaining PG&E's part and not maintaining their transmission lines. And they were able to, if any human being were responsible for that amount of death and destruction, you'd be in jail. But the fine was a negligible amount compared to their profits. And then they're allowed to continue on and keep doing business. Whereas the just solution would be, I think, to seize the assets and make it a publicly controlled utility. That's what it is anyways. But instead it's a private company. And so, that's probably the example that hits closest to home in my experience. But there's also another one that just gets me is these examples of communities trying to ban Walmarts. This is from a bit ago now, but there were several different communities that were trying to ban Walmarts because of the economic impacts, because of the environmental impacts, and the health impacts of having a Walmart in your town, all of which are negative. And Walmart was able to sue and use the argument that these city councils, people who were elected on a campaign of, I will help ensure that we don't have a Walmart in our community, were told that they were not allowed to talk about Walmart in public meetings as elected officials, because it violated Walmart's constitutional rights, but their First Amendment rights as elected officials were put on hold. And that happened in numerous places across the country. Probably like 15 years ago was kind of a big effort that Walmart was on to try and make it so that it wasn't even something that could be up for discussion in communities that they were trying to come into, because it was discrimination against them. So that was a couple examples.
So let's move and let's talk about Movement for a People's Party. They had their big convention, like, I don't know, like 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. You were there. You were incredible speaker, and we were talking, like, as we were watching, we were like, why isn't she emceeing this entire thing instead of Nick? But
we did have a whole thing about just like all of the name brand speakers that were at the top of the poster. Some of them were fine, of course, but a lot of the people like you that people weren't expecting. Those were the speeches that we were like, yeah, now here's someone talking about something.
I mean, we already knew that you were like a very good presenter, because obviously we were like familiar with you, but we were surprised at how well presented. Can you talk about just what that process was like and how you got reached out to, and how you felt things were run behind the scenes?
Yeah, so I think that Movement for a People's Party is doing great and important and critical work. And so I actually was on the coordinating committee for a little while earlier this summer, and I'm good friends with Nick, who is the, one of the founders, and who's kind of, the main bottom liner of the operation. I think he's just, his experience of coming out of the Bernie campaign and realizing that, we got to stop banging our heads against the wall and doing the same freaking thing every single time. And then we get nothing. And then we all try to do the same thing again. So I've been a Green, since I was 18, as I said, that day. And so, I don't have kind of the same experience of having to be disillusioned with the Democrats personally, because I, kind of started out that way. But I think there are many, 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 many people who are in that position after 2016 and now after this year, who are ready to stop turning things over to the Democrats when they won't do anything for us after a primary where we run a progressive. And I just thought that day was so inspiring. I mean, I thought that Nina Turner and Cornel West and Chris Hedges, like, those were all my kind of favorite. But I agree with you that part of what was so powerful was there were so many grassroots, activists, regular people who maybe don't have the kind of, huge platform like somebody like Marianne Williamson or somebody.
Not on the poster, but
yeah, but that it just goes to show the breadth and depth of people who are ready to come together. And I think, and that's why I am, excited to help form the People's Party, as opposed to trying to stick with the Green Party, which, I think the Green Party has done tremendous work to be the alternative for, over a generation now, and has been incredibly important. And yet at the same time, unfortunately, because of that kind of cutting edge role that the Green Party has played, has a good amount of baggage, some of it earned and deserved, and some of it not, some of it unfair, of being spoilers. And the Democrats have put a lot of resources into that narrative that, a third party, an independent party is really just a spoiler party, and people believe that. And so any party is going to have to, overcome that. But I think that we are in this moment of opportunity where we have, younger generations who there are, I'm kind of right on the edge of that, but people, I'm 41, people who are younger than me do not have any experience of anything being offered to them by the Democratic Party, including Obama. And so folks are just not tied into it the way that older generations are. And I think that gives us a tremendous opportunity to break out, and then also seeing how closely the Democrats are willing to come to Republican policies and only just being like just a tiny fraction away, and seeing how the Biden campaign was really willing to offer absolutely nothing policy wise to all of the Bernie supporters. All of that puts us in a situation of tremendous opportunity to break through and replace the Democratic Party, which is not serving minimum 30% of the electorate like that, and really isn't serving 95% of the electorate. And so there's a huge base upon which we can draw, which I have never seen that kind of opportunity, at least not in my lifetime.
Can you talk about, I mean, as somebody who has been a member of the Green Party for a while, that and as somebody who's been an online activist and done stuff that propagates on social media, running a good Zoom call is one thing, and ballot access is another thing. And what are some of the barriers that the Green Party has faced historically in terms of just the legal struggles and the signatures and all that other stuff, the need for money? And those are just a lot of hurdles. So what have been the biggest hurdles in your mind? And do you think that a different organization can clear those hurdles in a more effective way? And if so, how?
Well, I mean, I think that you're right that ballot access, I mean, the two corporate parties have, colluded together state after state to make access to the ballot pretty difficult. And the reality is that every single time that Greens or the Libertarians are kind of the other option on the other end are able to meet those challenges, then the next legislative cycle, they make it even harder. And so there's no question that, that it's a big lift. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be something that's going to be possible just because we want to do it. On the other hand, the Green Party has been able to secure ballot access in the overwhelming majority of states, and enough states to win the presidency every single election on a tiny budget, on $250,000-$300,000, right? And so to me, using all volunteer labor. And so that reality is there. I mean, yes, the Greens have not been able to elect anyone to Congress and have not been able to obviously win the presidency, but they have a lot working against them in terms of just kind of the idea of people, who is the Green Party? Well, the Green Party is, a party that can't win. That's part of why I think it's just important, just to kind of like a branding question of like a new party. And the reality is that we can get a new party on the ballot for not that much money, and it will take a lot of, volunteer hours, but certainly no more than Bernie Sanders was able to amass in the primary campaign. And they will throw everything at us, but we increasingly have people who have literally nowhere to go with the Democrats, and this threat of, well, you have to because there's a fascist on the other end is not resonating. It's not that it's not true, but we've got a fascist on that end too. He's just covert about it. And so people are, tired of that threat, I think. And it is going to be a lot of work, and it's not going to be easy. And probably every time we're successful, they'll make it harder because they do control the laws. But the amount of wealth inequality that we have, exacerbated by climate collapse, exacerbated at this point by a pandemic, which who knows when it will go away. All of that puts us in the situation where people have not very much to lose. And it's like, either we're going to need this new political party to represent people's needs and interests, or we're going to have an incredibly, violent situation, and we may have that anyway. At this point, but it's still as long as the two major parties and the people who are running for office are not offering any relief then we're creating the demand for there to be another party. And we have seen in other countries that when there is this kind of, and in the past of in our country as well, when the two parties that we have are not serving such a huge segment of the population, then one of them does become obsolete. There's a certain inevitability to it, and we have to do our organizing, and it's there's nothing guaranteed about how it's going to go down, but I absolutely believe that we can do this because we have to, and that's part of what I said that day, and I really really do mean it.
I've got one more question, and it might be you might punt on this question because it's a little spicy. Is there anything aside from the fact that they lose all the time and are being tagged with that branding? Is there anything that a different third party needs to do from a policy perspective that the Green Party isn't doing that you think will bring in that larger audience, or even from a marketing perspective, one or the other?
Well, I mean, I do think that the route that the People's Party is taking, where they're sort of embracing populism, and then trying to define what that is, progressive populism, not, Trump-style populism. I think that we are in a moment where that's what people want. I do think that that's what would resonate. And that's part of why Trump resonated and continues to resonate, even with all the incompetence. And so, and that's what the Democrats kind of refuse to embrace. And I think that puts them at a disadvantage against Trump. And I think it would ultimately also put them at a disadvantage against another party. And I think that the Greens, in part, the name, I mean, here we are with climate collapse. And I think that the Greens knew exactly what they were talking about. Prioritizing our environmental situation is obviously should be top of the list, but that doesn't really resonate with Americans, and for lots of reasons, including a lot of propaganda. But that's why it's like I am interested in us being successful, not in this party that I was part of at over the last 20 years winning because that's what I've been part of. And I think that the Greens do kind of need to drop that piece of it. I understand why, because there's been a lot of work and a lot of sacrifice that people have put in for the Greens, and also a lot of, it's like, we were right. You can't reform the Democratic Party, but chips on shoulders serves nobody in terms of getting us to the future that we need. And so I think the populism with a clear, anti-racist and, rooted in a class analysis as well, is going to be key to bringing people together who are sick of the establishment and right now see no offer that isn't establishment. And so, I just think that holding on to that populist identity is actually really important. And then defining what it means, making clear that doesn't mean, xenophobia and racism, but rather that, that's why I like the name People's Party. I mean, some people, are like, oh, it brings to mind communism, and I don't know. Tell me, a 30-year-old cares about that. I think it's just a plus in the long run. And we definitely should not be targeting our, kind of messaging and, just kind of narrative to the baby boomer generation at this point. I think that the baby boomers who care about the world will come with us, and we need to stop kind of trying to do everything on their terms, because that's not the way of, where we're headed.
I think if there's one thing people should be taking away from all this messaging, I loved what you said about not having a lot to lose and having a lot to gain when it comes to this stuff, because it's so true. And we talk about this on our show all the time that, electing a president won't even fix a lot of the problems that you want fixed, even if you elected the best president you can imagine. Mm-hmm. And that, on the other hand, getting a relatively radically left populist on your city council can make all the difference. Like in the case of Denver City Council, where one DSA council member swayed the issue on, privately funded prisons to get those defunded. So, I think when people, are looking at which compromises are they willing to make, I think that, they should be hearing people like you out on, there's a lot more to gain by just getting a few people that actually care about your values in any offices anywhere than, constantly compromising on somebody who barely cares about any values that you care about.
Yeah, absolutely, Kennedy. And actually, I was an elected official for 12 years. I was on my water district board in California. So it was, a local office. And I was a Green, which is kind of unusual. And actually, on some of the most important votes in terms of our water supply, I was able to build bridges with the Republicans on our board more effectively than the Democrats, because they believed in local control and they trusted me because I said who I was, and I didn't try to kind of be whoever the, political times thought that they should be. And I think that that's a lot of what ends up happening with politicians, is that people just don't trust them because they aren't willing to say who they are, even if it. And so even on the issues where we didn't agree, Republicans actually, the Republicans that I served with, and these are, were folks with integrity who cared about their local community, which is not necessarily.
Yes, you were in California.
Right. Well,
to be
yeah, I was in California, but at the same time, these folks that I was working with, both of them weren't originally from California. They were Republicans displaced, and they had a lot of resentment against Sacramento. I lived in a small rural place at the time, and we were just able to find common ground, and they were shocked about it. And the reason why was because we cared about our community, but they also trusted that even if they disagreed with me, they knew where I was coming from in terms of my values, because I was transparent about it. And I think that that's actually what's most important, and that's what draws people to leadership. And just as this is a little bit of a side, but I think that's a huge problem that we have on the left, that by and large, our leadership oftentimes isn't really willing to be honest to people about how bad of a situation we are in, what it's going to take to fix it, and that the solutions that are needed are not going to be quick fix. And there's just this tendency from the nonprofit world to kind of make it seem like, oh yeah, to appease our funders or something, like we're about to win. And it's like, no, we're actually not. We're really far away from winning. And I think that people would rather hear that, and then, how they can actually start working to build alliances for power, than that, it's all covered. And because it's like you look around and people can see that doesn't sound right, so I'm not going to believe and trust those people who are saying that, because what they're saying doesn't match my experience. And that's kind of what I mean with the populism, is it's like we have to have people who actually come out of a lived experience that regular folks can relate to. And the best way to do that is to have regular folks be the ones who we're empowering to be our leaders.
Kaitlin, what do people need to do when they leave this video to kind of join your universe and kind of work more directly with you?
Well, I would love to connect with folks through Move to Amend. So going to movetoamend.org and signing our petition, and kind of, at a minimum, committing to support us in that way. Will help a lot. And there's obviously, a volunteer page, and we do have local groups all over the country, and that's the main way that people plug in, is through our local chapters. I'd also be happy to connect with all of your listeners on Twitter. I should have put my handle in there instead of my name, but
don't worry, because we'll have it in the notes or whatever.
Okay, cool.
But it's at Kaitlin_SB. Yeah.
You got it. Yeah. So, I am on social media there personally, but also connecting through Move to Amend. And if anyone has, interest in the People's Party, they're doing great work and starting up chapters all over the country and working on that ballot access, working towards that in 2021. And so now is a great time to get into the ground floor on building that People's Party too.
Yeah, you can be one of the day ones, in terms of that, because they're literally just having organizing calls, and 50 or 60 people are showing up. You can be one of those people and be kind of instrumental in the mix, which is great. Kaitlin, I can't even express. You kind of moved your schedule around a little bit to come take this call, and we appreciate that. And it's just rad to finally sit down and hang out with you for a little while.
Likewise. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for a really good conversation. I'm happy to join you guys anytime. I really appreciate what you're doing. Thanks for spreading the word about such important stuff.
Absolutely. We'll definitely have to have you back sometime. This was wonderful.
Kennedy, you want to wrap it? You want to thank everybody? You want to
Sure.
feel?
Thank you everybody for watching / listening. As always, we are not safe for wonks. We appreciate you out there at NSF Wonks on Twitter. You can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/notsafe. We are 100% independent media that is made possible by the help of viewers like you through Patreon primarily. So get on over there. If you join the Patreon, you get access to our post shows, which we do after live streams at least 2 or 3 times per week, sometimes every day. Those are super fun. That comes in for even just $1, which that price is going to go up eventually. So if you want to get in on that low, extra good deal for the post shows, get in there now, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, that post show, that is your chance to be on the ground floor with us. So think about it. $1, that's a lot. So thank you for watching, and bye.